All right, so now that we know a little bit about the classic form of Java futures, we'll talk a bit more about completable futures, and we'll motivate why we need to have completable futures, right? So first I was motivating why we needed futures at all, and the main reason was to avoid synchronous blocking. That was the issue to be resolved. And now we're going to talk about completable futures and what they're going to add to the mix. So let's talk first about the pros and cons of using classic Java futures to do asynchronous operations. So there's some good things about them relative to purely blocking operations. So one is that they can potentially leverage inherent parallelism a little bit better. And there's a neat feature in Java 7 and 5, the earlier versions before Java 8, called the executor completion service. And there's an example you can see if you go look here that illustrates how to use the executor completion service to do searches for phrases in a large corpus of words. So here are some things you can do with the classic Java futures model. So what you can do is you can use the thread pool facilities that are available with the Java executor service, and you can go ahead and basically queue up asynchronous computations to run in a pool of threads. So the asynchronous computations here would be things like searching for phrases in strings or in files or whatnot. So you can do that asynchronously. You can have those things kind of run in the background. And then the way this works, depending on what concurrency model you choose, if you use, for example, a cached thread pool, then as you add more work to the pool, then it automatically and dynamically resizes the number of threads in the pool, which is cool. So that's all well and good. And what happens here is as things finish, the results are stuck into what's called a completion queue, which is basically a set of futures, and the items get stuck in the queue as the asynchronous computations complete. And then you can have one or more threads basically pulling the results of the asynchronously completed futures out of the executor completion service's completion queue, and then they do whatever cleanup processing that they are obliged to finish when they're done. So that's basically the kind of the classic and maybe the most effective way of using the earlier Java versions of futures. But there are a whole bunch of limitations with this approach. So one of the, let's talk about the limitations. Before we do that, we'll just quickly summarize what they can do. So a future can block until the results of an async two-way call are done. So you can block. That's kind of cool, sort of. And you can also cancel a future and check to see if the future has been canceled. So those are the things you can do, very basic things with a future. But there's all kinds of things you can't do. So one thing you cannot do with a Java future without adding a whole bunch of extra stuff, like what's called future task, you can't explicitly complete a future. So once a client gets a future back, you as the callee, the one that's doing the computation processing, cannot easily complete that future. You have to rely on other mechanisms like future tasks. So it's somewhat complicated to do. Another thing you can't do at all with classic futures is you can't chain them together fluently in order to handle asynchronous results as they complete. Now, it may not at all be clear yet what we mean by chaining together, and I'll show you a whole bunch of examples here, either today or next time. But the basic deal is you can only have one thread sort of wait for one future at a time. So it's difficult to wait for more than one thing, and it's difficult to chain the results together. And if you have a bunch of asynchronous operations that are all running, you can't easily wait for all of them to complete. You can only sort of wait for one of them at a time, which is really awkward and inefficient and error-prone to program. Now, until you see the magic of completable futures, it's not even clear at first glance what I mean by some of this stuff, right? What does it mean to wait for lots of futures to complete? Or what does it mean to chain things together? But when we talk about completable futures, you'll see how they fix all these limitations with kind of the classic futures. And one of the main problems with a classic future is you cannot compose them together. And again, I'll explain what that means, but it's like trying to fit things together that don't really quite connect, right? So that's sort of the image here. These pieces don't really fit together. They're not meant to be composed. They're meant to be used individually. Okay, so that's kind of the limitations with Java, classic Java futures. And those have always been lame. And so What we'll see in a second is how the new versions address the lameness.